The camera's mechanical click echoed across the wooden platform of Millbrook Railway Station as photographer Samuel Mitchell ducked beneath his black cloth for the final time. Thomas Hartwell stood motionless beside his younger brother Edward, both men positioned exactly as Mitchell had instructed them moments before. The August heat pressed down on the rural Pennsylvania station like a heavy blanket, causing beads of sweat to form on Thomas's brow despite his unusual composure. "Hold perfectly still now," Mitchell called out, his voice muffled by the cloth draped over his head and camera. "Just a few more seconds." Thomas felt his brother's shoulder brush against his own as Edward shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the lengthy exposure time required for the daguerreotype process. But Thomas remained statue still, his dark eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the camera lens. There was something unsettling in his gaze, a depth that seemed to hold secrets no 19-year-old should possess. Station Master William Crane watched the proceedings from his office window, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. He had seen countless passengers come and go through his station over the past 15 years, but something about the Hartwell brothers made him uneasy. Perhaps it was the way Thomas moved when he thought no one was looking, or the strange scraping sound his boots made against the wooden platform boards. "There," Mitchell announced, emerging from beneath his cloth with a satisfied expression. "That should do nicely. The plate will need time to develop, but I expect you'll be quite pleased with the result." Edward Hartwell smiled and extended his hand toward the photographer, but Thomas remained motionless, his attention now focused on the train tracks that stretched into the distance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the platform, and Thomas's shadow fell in exactly the same direction as his brother's, pointing toward the camera they had just faced. "Thomas," Edward called softly, touching his brother's arm, "the gentleman is finished with us." Thomas turned slowly, and for just a moment, Crane could have sworn he saw the young man's feet pointing in the wrong direction beneath his dark trousers. The station master blinked hard and looked again, but Thomas was already walking normally toward his brother, his footsteps creating the same hollow sounds as any other person crossing the wooden platform. "My apologies," Thomas said to Mitchell, his voice carrying an odd formality that seemed beyond his years. "I was lost in thought." Mitchell packed his equipment carefully, occasionally glancing at Thomas with curiosity. There was something different about the young man, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. The way Thomas held himself, perhaps, or the deliberate manner in which he placed each step. As the photographer departed on the evening train, Crane made his way onto the platform to speak with the brothers. They were waiting for the westbound locomotive that wouldn't arrive until the following morning, and something about their presence troubled him deeply. "You boys have somewhere to stay tonight?" Crane asked, approaching them with the cautious friendliness of a man who had learned to trust his instincts about strangers. "We'll manage," Edward replied quickly, but Thomas remained silent, his gaze now fixed on the ground beneath their feet. Crane followed Thomas's stare and felt his breath catch in his throat. Where Thomas stood, the wooden planks of the platform showed strange wear marks, as if someone had been walking backwards across them repeatedly. The scratches ran in the opposite direction from the normal foot traffic patterns that marked the rest of the platform. "Son," Crane said carefully, addressing Thomas directly, "is everything all right with you?" Thomas looked up slowly, and his eyes held a sadness that seemed far older than his 19 years. "Everything is as it should be, Mr. Crane. Though I suspect that will change very soon." The cryptic response sent a chill down Crane's spine, but before he could ask what Thomas meant, both brothers had turned and walked toward the far end of the platform. Crane watched them go, noting with growing alarm that, while Edward's footsteps created the normal sounds of heel-to-toe walking, Thomas's steps produced an entirely different rhythm, as if he were somehow walking in reverse while moving forward. That night, Crane barely slept. Every sound outside his station quarters seemed amplified, every creak of the old building felt significant. When dawn finally broke on August 16th, He rushed to check on the Hartwell brothers, only to find Edward sitting alone on the platform bench, staring at a set of footprints in the dirt beside the tracks. The footprints led away from where Thomas had last been seen, but they faced the wrong direction entirely, as if their maker had been walking backwards into the wilderness beyond the station. Edward looked up at Crane with tears streaming down his face, unable to explain what had happened to his brother, or how such impossible tracks could exist. Dr. Edmund Morse would arrive from Philadelphia 2 days later, summoned by Crane's urgent telegram. After examining the scene and interviewing Edward extensively, the learned physician would shake his head in bewilderment and declare the entire situation impossible according to every principle of human anatomy he had studied. But Crane knew what he had witnessed, and as he prepared his final report on the incident, his hand trembled as he wrote the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "The very ground seemed to reject his presence," wrote Station Master William Crane in his final report. The train's brakes screamed against steel as it lurched to an emergency stop at Millbrook Station. Thomas Hartwell pressed his face against the window, watching the small crowd of passengers who had gathered on the platform suddenly step back in unified horror, their faces twisted with revulsion and fear as they caught sight of what emerged from the third car. Samuel Hartwell descended the metal steps with deliberate care, his movements precise despite the burden he carried. The grotesque mass that hung from his torso swayed with each step, its pale flesh catching the harsh afternoon sunlight. What should have been his twin brother's body dangled lifelessly, connected at the chest by a bridge of bone and sinew that defied nature's design. The dead twin's head rolled backward, unseeing eyes staring at the coal-stained sky. "Dear God in heaven," whispered Station Master Jeremiah Caldwell, his weathered hands trembling as he gripped his clipboard. The manifest showed 2 passengers, but only one man stood breathing on his platform. Caldwell had worked the rails for 30 years, had seen men crushed by freight cars and burned by boiler explosions, but nothing had prepared him for this walking nightmare. Thomas moved forward, his living twin's face set in grim determination. Each step sent ripples through the crowd as people stumbled backward, mothers clutching their children, men reaching instinctively for weapons they didn't carry. The whispers began immediately, spreading like wildfire through the assembled onlookers. "It's the devil's work," hissed Martha Henley, the baker's wife, crossing herself repeatedly. "No Christian soul should bear such a curse." Dr. Silas Whitmore pushed through the crowd, his medical bag clutched tightly in his pale hands. The physician had been summoned by telegraph just hours before, though the message had been cryptic at best. Now, faced with this medical impossibility, his scientific mind reeled between fascination and revulsion. "Sir," Dr. Whitmore called out, his voice barely steady, "I am the town physician. You appear to be in need of medical attention." Thomas turned toward the doctor, and for the first time, the crowd saw his face clearly. Where Samuel's features showed the peaceful stillness of death, Thomas bore the weight of unbearable suffering. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his skin held the pallor of someone who had not slept in weeks. When he spoke, his voice carried the hollow tone of a man who had bargained with forces beyond human understanding. "Doctor," Thomas said, his words measured and deliberate, "what you see before you is not a medical condition. It is a punishment." The dead twin's arm swayed grotesquely as Thomas shifted his weight. "My brother and I made a pact that should never have been spoken. Now I carry the consequence of our folly." The crowd pressed closer despite their fear, drawn by the magnetic horror of Thomas's confession. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his professional instincts overriding his revulsion. "When did your brother pass?" the doctor asked, pulling out a small notebook with shaking fingers. "3 days ago, on the train from Philadelphia," Thomas replied, "but death has not freed him from our bond. Until I fulfill what we promised, he remains bound to me, and I to him." Station Master Caldwell finally found his voice. "Sir, I must ask you to state your business in Millbrook. The other passengers are becoming disturbed." Thomas's eyes swept across the crowd, taking in their expressions of disgust and fear. A thin smile played at the corners of his mouth as if he found some dark humor in their reaction. "My business, good sir, is with the coal mines. Samuel and I came seeking work, but now I must complete a task that requires specific conditions." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "There are things buried deep in these mountains, things that call to those who have made bargains they cannot break." Dr. Whitmore scribbled frantically in his notebook, his scientific mind struggling to process the impossible anatomy before him. The connection between the twins defied every principle of human development he had studied. Yet here stood living proof that nature's laws could be bent, perhaps broken entirely. As Thomas began walking toward the town center, the crowd parted before him like water before a ship's prow. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts, their young minds unable to comprehend what they witnessed. The men exchanged knowing glances, each thinking the same unspoken thought. Whatever Thomas Hartwell sought in their quiet mining town, it would bring nothing but trouble. The late historian Margaret Vance, who would spend decades researching this incident, later observed with chilling accuracy, "What the authorities wished to conceal," noted historian Margaret Vance in 1967, "often reveals more than what they chose to record." The locomotive's brass whistle pierced the humid afternoon air as steam hissed from the iron beast's cylinders, marking the exact moment when the impossible became undeniably real. At precisely 2:47 p.m. on August 15, 1876, the westbound train shuddered to a halt at Millbrook Station, its metal wheels grinding against worn rails with a sound that seemed to echo longer than natural law should have allowed. The overcast sky hung heavy with the promise of rain, casting everything in shades of gray that made shadows deeper and reality more uncertain. Station Master Crane stood on the weathered wooden platform, his pocket watch clicking shut as he noted the train's punctual arrival in his leather-bound logbook. The routine gesture of recording the time would later prove to be one of the most important observations in the county's history, though Crane had no way of knowing that the two passengers about to emerge would challenge everything he understood about the natural world. Thomas Whitmore stepped down from the passenger car first, his movements fluid and ordinary as his boots made solid contact with the platform's sun-bleached planks. His traveling coat, dusty from the journey, settled naturally around his shoulders as he reached up to adjust his hat against the threatening weather. Every gesture spoke of normalcy, of a man who moved through the world as men had always moved, forward, with purpose, following the invisible currents of time and space that governed all human motion. But then Samuel appeared in the doorway of the passenger car, and the very air around the platform seemed to thicken with wrongness. Station Master Crane's pen froze halfway through writing the passenger count as his eyes struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. The younger Whitmore brother moved with fluid, unnatural grace, each step carrying him backward while somehow propelling him forward. His body faced the same direction as any normal person would when disembarking, yet his feet seemed to glide in reverse, creating a movement that defied every law of physics and human understanding. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Crane whispered under his breath, his calloused fingers gripping the logbook so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The words came out as barely more than a breath, lost in the settling steam from the locomotive, but they carried the weight of a man witnessing something that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Samuel's descent from the train car continued with that same impossible fluidity, each backward step somehow moving him closer to his destination rather than away from it. His traveling bag swung naturally at his side, and his coat billowed in the afternoon breeze exactly as it should have. Yet everything about his locomotion suggested that he was navigating the world according to rules that existed nowhere in nature's grand design. The two brothers stood together on the platform, and the contrast between them created a tableau that burned itself into Station Master Crane's memory. Thomas, solid and real and moving through space as God intended, cast a shadow that fell naturally toward the west where the sun hung behind the gathering clouds. Samuel's shadow, however, seemed to bend and twist in ways that made Crane's eyes water when he tried to focus on it directly. The older brother moved as any man would, Crane would later testify to the county sheriff, his voice shaking as he recalled that afternoon. But the younger seemed to be walking away while approaching us. I've seen men walk drunk, seen them stumble with injury, but this was something else entirely. It was as if he had learned to move through the world using rules that the rest of us were never taught. The brothers made their way across the platform toward the town proper, their conversation carrying on the humid air like any normal discourse between traveling companions. Yet even their voices seemed to contribute to the growing sense of unreality that surrounded Samuel's presence. Thomas spoke forward into the conversation, his words emerging and fading as words should. Samuel's responses, while perfectly coherent and appropriately timed, seemed to hang in the air for just a moment too long, as if they were traveling backward through time to reach their intended listeners. Dr. Whitmore's examination, conducted later that evening in the sterile confines of his medical office, would yield findings that challenged every principle of human anatomy he had studied during his years at Harvard Medical College. His examination notes, written in the precise copperplate script that had earned him recognition among his peers, described feet that possessed all proper bones and joints, yet oriented in defiance of nature's design. The doctor's trained fingers had traced the familiar landmarks of human anatomy, the arch, the heel, the delicate bones that allowed for normal locomotion, yet everything was arranged in a configuration that should have made walking impossible, let alone the fluid backward gliding that Samuel demonstrated with such unnerving ease. The skin showed no signs of surgical alteration, no scars or marks that might indicate some elaborate medical procedure. These were natural human feet, formed by the same biological processes that shaped every other human foot, yet twisted by some unknown force into an arrangement that defied comprehension. Most disturbing of all, the brothers' boots revealed the truth of their impossible nature through the simple evidence of wear. The leather soles, crafted by skilled cobblers and worn smooth through months of walking, displayed patterns that matched their owner's anatomy perfectly. Thomas's boots showed the normal wear of heel-to-toe movement, the leather thin where it should be thin, worn where decades of medical knowledge suggested it would be worn. Samuel's boots, however, displayed wear patterns that corresponded exactly to his backward-facing feet, as if even his footwear had been shaped by the same mysterious force that governed his impossible locomotion. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when traveling portraitist Miss Eleanor Vash arrived at the hotel where the brothers had taken rooms. Her reputation as a skilled photographer had preceded her to Millbrook, and several prominent citizens had arranged for portrait sessions during her brief stay. The heavy photographic equipment, transported carefully in wooden cases lined with velvet, represented the cutting edge of imaging technology, capable of capturing details that the human eye might miss. Miss Vash prepared her camera with the methodical precision that had made her one of the most sought-after portraitists in the region. The brothers posed naturally, Thomas standing slightly behind his younger sibling, both men wearing the serious expressions that the long exposure times of tintype photography demanded. The late afternoon sun, filtered through the gathering clouds, provided the perfect lighting for what should have been a routine portrait session. But when Miss Vash developed the photographic plates in her portable darkroom that evening, she discovered something that the original daguerreotype had somehow concealed. In the shadows cast by the fading daylight, Samuel's reflection appeared to be facing the opposite direction from his physical form. The tintype clearly showed a man standing beside his brother, facing forward toward the camera as any subject would, yet his shadow and reflection suggested someone whose very essence was oriented backward through space and time. Miss Vash stared at the developed image for nearly an hour, her trained eye examining every detail for some technical explanation that might account for the impossible image captured on her photographic plate. She had taken thousands of portraits during her career, documenting the faces and lives of people across the growing nation, Yet never had her camera revealed something that so thoroughly challenged her understanding of light, shadow, and the fundamental nature of human existence. The photographic plates, carefully stored in the basement of Whitmore Medical College, would survive for decades as silent testimony to that impossible afternoon. Workers who discovered the glass negatives during the building's demolition in 1934 would find that the images had somehow changed over time, preserving not just the moment when the photograph was taken, but events that occurred afterward, as if the very act of capturing Samuel's image had created a window through which future moments could leak backward into the past. "I have seen many curiosities in my profession," Miss Vash wrote to her sister in Baltimore that very evening, her normally steady handwriting betraying the tremor in her hands as she recalled the day's events. "But never have I captured a soul walking backwards through time." The cold metal calipers pressed against Samuel's bare foot as Dr. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles, squinting at the measurements. The hospital examination room reeked of carbolic acid and fear, its whitewashed walls seeming to close in around the two brothers who sat side by side on the wooden bench. August 16th had dawned gray and oppressive, matching the growing dread that settled over everyone who encountered the peculiar case of Samuel and Thomas. 7 3/4 inches, Dr. Whitmore muttered, his voice barely concealing his frustration. The German-manufactured calipers, precision instruments imported at considerable expense, registered perfectly normal dimensions for Samuel's foot. Yet something was terribly, impossibly wrong. The physician's hands trembled slightly as he recorded the measurements in his leather-bound journal, ink blotting where his pen lingered too long. Thomas watched his brother with wide, frightened eyes, his own feet having measured normally in every conceivable way. The X-ray crystallography that would later reveal Samuel's impossible internal bone structure was still decades away. But Dr. Whitmore possessed an intuition that told him the brother's condition defied every principle of medical science he had learned. Samuel sat unnaturally still, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, while an unsettling silence filled the spaces between his words. When he spoke, the sounds seemed to hang in the air like smoke, dissipating in the wrong direction. The screech of train wheels against steel rails announced Professor Marcus Aldrich's arrival at Millbrook Station. Word of the brothers' condition had traveled through telegraph lines to the prestigious Bethlehem Institute of Natural Philosophy, where Aldrich served as head of experimental research. He arrived carrying a bulky phonograph machine and several blank wax cylinders, his gray beard meticulously groomed despite the urgency of his journey. The professor's eyes held the gleam of scientific curiosity mixed with deep unease as he set up his recording equipment in the hospital's consultation room. "Please state your name and age for the record," Professor Aldrich instructed, adjusting the phonograph's needle with steady hands. Samuel opened his mouth, and the words that emerged sent a chill through everyone present. They sounded like English, perfectly articulated and grammatically correct, yet something fundamental was wrong with their temporal arrangement. When Aldrich played back the recording, rotating the cylinder at normal speed, Samuel's testimony emerged as clear, fluent English sentences spoken in complete reverse order. Thomas gripped the edge of his chair until his knuckles turned white, watching his brother speak words that seemed to originate from some impossible future and travel backward through time. The professor's face grew pale as he realized the implications of what he was witnessing. This was not merely a speech impediment or psychological condition, it was a violation of the natural order itself. Dr. Thaddeus Cole, the county coroner, arrived later that morning with his medical bag and a reputation for unflinching scientific observation. His examination of Samuel revealed the most disturbing finding yet. As Cole pressed his fingers against Samuel's wrist, searching for a pulse, his expression shifted from professional concentration to bewildered horror. The blood in Samuel's veins flowed in the wrong direction, traveling from his extremities toward his heart in a pattern that should have killed him instantly. "This is impossible," Cole whispered, his voice cracking as he repeated the measurement. His sealed report, locked away in the hospital's confidential files, would later describe physiological reversals that challenged every principle of human anatomy. Telegraph messages flew between Philadelphia, Harvard, and Johns Hopkins, carrying desperate requests for consultation with the nation's most renowned anatomists. Each response carried the same underlying message. What they were observing could not exist within the bounds of known science. The following morning, August 17th, brought no relief from the mounting tension. At precisely 11:30 a.m., Dr. Whitmore prepared plaster casts of both brothers' feet, hoping the physical impressions might reveal some clue to their condition. Thomas's cast showed normal weight distribution patterns, the deepest impressions at heel and toe where physics demanded they should be. Samuel's cast told a different story entirely, one that made Dr. Whitmore's hands shake as he examined it under the morning light streaming through the hospital windows. The weight distribution in Samuel's footprint suggested he was perpetually walking backward, even when moving forward. The deepest impressions appeared where they should not be, creating a pattern that defied every law of motion and balance. It was as if Samuel existed in a state of constant retreat from his own destination, his very essence flowing against the current of time itself. Hospital orderly James McKenna had worked the night shift, mopping floors and checking on patients with the methodical routine of 15 years' experience. Nothing in his tenure had prepared him for what he witnessed in the early hours of August 18th. As he cleaned the corridor outside the brothers' room, McKenna heard the distinctive sound of footsteps approaching from the far end of the hallway. The steady rhythm of leather soles against wooden flooring grew louder, yet when he looked up, the corridor remained completely empty. Several seconds passed before Samuel's figure appeared at the distant end of the hall, walking toward McKenna with measured steps. The orderly's mop clattered to the floor as he realized the impossible truth. He had heard Samuel's approach before the young man had begun walking. The footsteps had preceded their maker, as if the hospital itself remembered the pattern of Samuel's movement before he had performed it. McKenna's testimony, given later that morning with his voice trembling and his hands clasped tightly together, would become one of the most chilling accounts in the hospital's records. The sound of his walking preceded his arrival, McKenna testified, his eyes darting nervously toward the corridor where the impossible had occurred, as if the earth remembered his passage before he had taken it. The stark fluorescent lights of Pennsylvania General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the consultation room as Dr. Margaret Whitmore spread the X-ray films across the illuminated viewing board. The black and white images revealed an impossibility that made her hands tremble despite 30 years of medical practice. Samuel Hartwell's bone structure defied every principle of human anatomy she had ever studied. "This cannot be correct," she whispered to herself, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles and leaning closer to examine the films. The femur, tibia, and fibula all curved in directions that should have rendered walking impossible, yet she had witnessed Samuel's peculiar backward locomotion with her own eyes just hours earlier. Dr. Harrison Webb, the hospital's chief radiologist, entered the room carrying a fresh pot of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who had not slept in 48 hours. His usually pristine white coat bore coffee stains and wrinkles that spoke of countless hours spent analyzing the inexplicable case. "The bone density measurements came back," Webb announced, setting down his coffee cup with a ceramic clink that echoed in the sterile room. "Samuel's skeletal structure shows normal calcium levels and healthy marrow composition. By every standard test we have, he possesses the bones of a perfectly healthy 17-year-old male." Dr. Whitmore turned from the X-rays, her face pale in the artificial light. The weight of the impossible pressed down upon her shoulders like a physical burden. She had built her career on logic, on the predictable responses of the human body to injury and illness. This case threatened to unravel everything she understood about medical science. "Then how do you explain this?" she asked, pointing to the films with a trembling finger. "These bones curve backward at angles that would snap under the slightest pressure. Yet Samuel walks, backwards, yes, but he walks without apparent pain or difficulty." Webb approached the viewing board, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The fluorescent bulb above them flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the impossible images. He studied the X-rays in silence, his trained eye searching for any detail they might have missed in their previous examinations. Meanwhile, 3 floors below in the hospital's administrative wing, Detective Inspector Charles Hoffman paced the length of the records room with the restless energy of a caged predator. His investigation had consumed 6 weeks, and every lead had dissolved into vapor upon close examination. The detective's normally immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. His tie hung loosely around his neck, and his usually polished shoes were scuffed from countless hours of fieldwork. "There has to be a rational explanation," Hoffman muttered to himself, rifling through witness statements and photographic evidence spread across a metal table. People don't just develop reversed bone structure overnight. Officer Patricia Mills, his junior partner, looked up from a stack of hospital records she had been reviewing. Her notepad contained pages of observations and theories, each one crossed out as evidence emerged to contradict them. "Sir, what if we're approaching this from the wrong angle?" she suggested, her voice carrying a note of hesitation. "What if the Hartwell brothers aren't frauds or medical anomalies? What if there's something else entirely?" Hoffman stopped pacing and fixed her with a sharp stare. His gray eyes, hardened by 15 years of police work, searched her face for any sign that she was mocking the investigation. Finding none, he leaned against the table, causing the metal legs to groan under his weight. "Continue," he said simply. Mills consulted her notes, her pen tapping nervously against the paper. The room's single window offered a view of the hospital parking lot, where autumn leaves swirled in the evening wind like nature's own mystery dance. "Professor Aldrich from the university has been recording unusual phenomena around the brothers," she explained. "His equipment detects sounds that haven't happened yet, conversations that take place hours before they're actually spoken, and Samuel's footprints—" She paused, struggling to articulate the impossible. "They appear in locations before he walks there." The detective's expression darkened as he processed this information. His rational mind rebelled against such impossibilities, yet the evidence continued to accumulate in ways that defied conventional explanation. Every attempt to debunk the case had only deepened the mystery. Back in the medical wing, Dr. Whitmore received a call that would change everything. The night nurse's voice crackled through the intercom system, tinged with barely controlled panic. "Doctor, you need to come to the Hartwell room immediately," the voice reported. "Something's happened." Dr. Whitmore and Dr. Webb exchanged alarmed glances before hurrying through the hospital corridors. Their footsteps echoed against the polished linoleum floors as they navigated past sleeping patients and dimly lit nursing stations. The hospital's night shift moved with quiet efficiency around them, unaware that they were about to witness something that would challenge the very foundations of reality. They arrived at room 314 to find night watchman Peter Collins standing motionless outside the door, his face drained of all color. The elderly security guard held his flashlight in trembling hands, its beam dancing erratically across the floor. "They're gone," Collins whispered, his voice barely audible. "Both of them. Vanished." Dr. Whitmore approached the door, noting that the heavy bolt remained firmly in place on the outside. The security modifications installed after previous incidents showed no signs of tampering. She slid the bolt back with a metallic scraping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. The room beyond lay empty, but not undisturbed. The hospital beds remained perfectly made, as if they had never been occupied. However, across the sterile white floor, a trail of footprints told an impossible story. Samuel's distinctive backward impressions led from his bed across the room, growing darker and more defined as they approached the far wall. Dr. Webb entered behind her, his medical training warring with the evidence of his senses. The footprints continued right up to the solid brick wall and, seemingly, into it. The wall showed no cracks, no hidden passages, no sign of any disturbance whatsoever. "This is impossible," Webb breathed, kneeling beside the final footprint. The impression pressed clearly into the linoleum tiles, as real and tangible as any evidence they had collected throughout their investigation. Collins, summoning courage from some deep reserve, stepped into the room. His weathered hands shook as he pointed toward the wall where the footprints disappeared. "I checked this room at 3 o'clock exactly," he reported, his voice growing stronger as he focused on the facts. "Both brothers were sleeping peacefully. I made my next round at 3:17. The door was still bolted from the outside just as we left it, but when I looked through the observation window—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Dr. Whitmore examined the wall with scientific precision, running her hands across the brick surface and searching for any concealed mechanism that might explain the impossible. The wall remained solid and unyielding under her touch, its surface unmarked by any kind of passage or disturbance. The implications of what they were witnessing settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Every rational explanation they had constructed over the previous weeks crumbled in the face of this final impossibility. The brothers Hartwell had not escaped through conventional means. They had simply vanished into something beyond human understanding. Hours later, as dawn light filtered through the hospital windows, Dr. Whitmore sat alone in her office, staring at a blank case file that would soon be closed forever. Her fountain pen rested motionless in her hand as she contemplated the words that would serve as her final professional judgment on the most extraordinary case of her career. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, marking the passage of time in a world where the Hartwell brothers existed in reverse temporal flow. Each tick seemed to echo with the memory of Samuel's anticipatory footsteps and the impossible recordings that Professor Aldrich had captured. Finally, Dr. Whitmore began to write, her elegant handwriting flowing across the official letterhead. The words came slowly, each one carefully chosen to convey the profound mystery that had defied their every attempt at rational explanation. As she set down her pen and read her final entry, the morning sun cast long shadows across her desk. The case file that had consumed months of investigation would be archived with one simple conclusion that acknowledged the limits of human understanding. "Some mysteries," Dr. Whitmore concluded in her final case note, "are not meant for human understanding. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of mystery, folklore, and the eerie strangeness of the unexplained. Its purpose is to raise awareness, spark curiosity, and inspire reflection on the power of storytelling and the fascination with the unknown."